When Jesus of Nazareth came out of the desert, after overcoming the macabre temptations of Lucifer, he began his journey to Galilee, where he began to travel through cities and towns, preaching the word of his Father, announcing the good news of the kingdom of God. Everywhere he went, he performed various miracles for those who needed it most. He healed the sick, raised the dead, and gave bread to those who had nothing to eat. For all these acts of love and kindness, and especially for all that he preached, many men began to follow him because they wanted to be like him. Moreover, they defended that Jesus was the Son of God, who would save the world. Many were those who accompanied Jesus, and when the moment indicated by his Father arrived, Jesus chose among his disciples those who would become his apostles: Peter, James the elder, John, Andrew, Bartholomew, James the younger, Judas Iscariot, Judas Thaddeus, Matthew, Philip, Simon, and Thomas, the Nazarene, named with a loud voice, thus choosing 12 men from among his disciples, and told them that they would be his apostles, who would accompany him forever to preach the gospel. After Jesus was crucified for calling himself the Son of God and preaching his word, the apostles of the Messiah continued with his great legacy on earth, as they continued preaching and teaching from city to city the word that Jesus had preached to them, thus initiating Christianity. For many years, the apostles of the Son of God were cruelly persecuted for their teachings and their religion. The deaths of Jesus' apostles were not very different from those of their Lord, for they were full of cruelty, pain, and suffering, just as Jesus Christ lived before his death. Many were cruelly killed and sentenced to atrocious punishments for defending their beliefs. But none of Jesus' apostles renounced the word of the Son of God. So how did the most faithful apostles of Jesus Christ die? Peter. After the death of Jesus, Peter became one of the most absolute leaders of early Christianity. He dedicated his entire life to teaching his religion, so he was persecuted and arrested on several occasions, which led him to be constantly on a series of journeys through various cities. As for his last days, it is said that Peter, the name given by Jesus, since in reality his name was Simon, undertook a journey to Rome to teach the new religion. Several years passed and Peter consolidated a small but very believing group of Christians. However, the Emperor of Rome, Claudius Nero, did not agree with the beliefs and customs of the Apostle Peter, so on several occasions he threatened him with death. At that time Nero had unleashed great persecution against Christians, because he had blamed them for being the ones who caused the great fire of Rome, and because of this many innocent people had been killed. For Peter, the threats of the Roman emperor were not an obstacle, because his love for his doctrine was so deep that he continued with several works to extend it. It is also believed that Peter founded the first house of the papacy in Rome, so he is considered the first pope of Christian history. The vile Roman emperor had imprisoned the apostle several times. However, on several occasions he was released by the apostles' cunning, but unfortunately, in one of Nero's persecutions, Peter was falsely accused as a ruffian and was finally sentenced to crucifixion. Peter, unhappy, would have accepted his death. However, he would have requested that his crucifixion be different from that of his shepherd Jesus Christ, for he considered himself unworthy to receive the same death as his master. It is said that Peter would have asked to be crucified with his head downwards, thus being different from the cross on which Jesus Christ died. Andrew was one of the first disciples of John the Baptist, and when he learned what Jesus preached, he did not hesitate to follow him as his disciple. Andrew was Peter's brother, and it was he who brought Peter to Jesus for his transformation. It is believed that after the death of Jesus Christ, Andrew would have traveled to Greece, Asia Minor, and Siena to teach and preach the Christian religion. In the end, he would have settled in Greece, where he is considered the father of the Greek Orthodox Church, and during the time he preached the Christian faith, he managed to convert many people to his religion. And not unlike what happened to his brother Peter, Andrew was also persecuted by the Greek governor of Patra, as Andrew would have been involved in one of the events that filled the governor Hippias with fury. It is said that during the time Andrew was preaching in the city of Patra, he worked several miracles, which convinced the people of his holiness and faith. One of the miracles that marked the death of Andrew was when he managed to heal the wife of the governor Hippias from a serious fatal disease, causing the wife of the maximum leader of Patra to end up becoming a Christian because of the faith she had to heal the heart disease she had. Time later, Andrew would have convinced the brother of Epias to follow the steps of his sister-in-law and convert to the Christian faith. He would have accepted the transformation, and little by little Christianity was consolidating and spreading in Greece thanks to the Apostle Andrew. On the other hand, seeing his wife and brother converted to Christianity, Epias became very angry, because he was totally against this religion. So when he saw that his brother also decided to follow this path, he exploded with anger and sent to imprison the apostle. When he had him imprisoned, Epias claimed what happened within his territory and condemned the apostle to be crucified. Despite Andrew's struggle for his freedom, he did not manage to save himself, so he finally demanded something very important for him at the time of his death. Andrew would have told his captors that he was not worthy of receiving the same death as that of his master. So kneeling, he asked that his cross be in the form of an X so that his death would be different. He defended the worship of the cross, because he said it was the symbol of the holiness of Jesus. Also asked not to be nailed to the cross but rather to be tied to it, so he would not have the same end as Jesus Christ. Andrew was for 3 days preaching from his cross until finally, he had no more strength left. His death had come, his voice died out and his breath faded away. James the Elder. James, who was the brother of John the Apostle, joined the disciples of Jesus when his brother began to follow John the Baptist. They both worked in the fishing trade and their life was quite good. James the Elder continued preaching after Jesus Christ left the earth. It is said that the Apostle James settled down to preach and spread the Christian faith in Jerusalem and Judea, and like his teacher Jesus, he was cruelly persecuted on several occasions. About the year 44 AD, during the reign of Herod, James the Elder became the first martyr of Jesus, for he died because of preaching his word. Herod was a sovereign obsessed with power, also had a great disregard for religion, and became a most hated by Orthodox Jews and Christians of the time. Because of his whims was the cause of great killings against the worshippers of God. Also, Herod conspired against the Apostle James the Great, because he was totally against religion. So one day he sent one of his most loyal royal guards to capture the unfortunate apostle. The guard had captured him, as ordered by his king, and as soon as he presented him before Herod, he ordered him to mistreat him cruelly. Being there, the loyal soldier of Herod was dismayed to see the suffering of the apostle. He could not contain his pain and guilt for having taken him to his death. So he also declared to be a Christian. Herod looked at him with contempt and ordered them both to be executed. The condemned guard knelt beside James and asked him for forgiveness for what he had done, and after a long silence he answered him saying, "I wish you peace." After a few minutes, both were executed with the sword in the eyes of the great Herod, who smiled to see his victory. John, the Apostle, was the brother of James the Elder. Both were from a wealthy family and never felt deprived. So John in his youth had a haughty attitude during that period of his life. However, over time, he forgot all those and became a disciple of Jesus. John and James were inseparable brothers, so in the writings, they are always mentioned together. Both preached the Christian faith in Jerusalem and Judea and were persecuted for their religious acts. After the death of his beloved brother James, John did not stop teaching Christianity but rather grew stronger, which caused him to be imprisoned and mistreated on several occasions. The cruel punishments that John received made him stronger because he always managed to escape death. Also, one of the most controversial attempts on his life was when he was given a poisoned chalice. Fortunately, God would have anticipated it, saving his life. It is said that during one of the revolts in which he was arrested, they sentenced his death through a cauldron with boiling oil in which they were going to immerse him. But fortunately, he was saved and released. Despite all the atrocities he experienced because of his faith, John the Apostle did not stop preaching, and during his travels, it is said that he reached Asia Minor, where he was exiled to the island of Patmos, where he remained for several years. While there, John wrote several of his most famous books because Jesus appeared on the island, revealing to him several future events, which he wrote about in his writings. Sometime later, John was finally released from the island of Patmos, continuing his journeys preaching the Christian faith. Fortunately, John was the only one of the apostles who died of natural causes, since John died due to his advanced age, escaping an atrocious death like his companions. Philip. Philip would have traveled from the same town from which Peter and Andrew left, in search of Jesus to become his disciple. Then he would have traveled to Hierapolis, passing through Greece and so Minor preaching his faith. In all the places he visited he was persecuted, but he was also widely accepted by many who devoted themselves to listening to his words. It is said that he spent his last days in Hierapolis and that he was sentenced to death by a proconsul of the city, because the apostle Philip had intervened in the transformation of the proconsul's wife to the Christian faith, which infuriated the magistrate, and this very offended, ordered his death. Tradition has it that he died on the gallows and that even as he was about to be hanged, he asked that his body be wrapped in papyrus and not in linen, because he considered that his body was not worthy of being treated as the body of Jesus, and thus he would honor his death. Bartholomew. It is said that Nathanael, later called Bartholomew by Jesus, would have been the only one of the 12 apostles to belong to a wealthy royal family. Despite this, he joined the disciples of Christ, inculcating and evangelizing together with Philip in Asia Minor, Greece, and Hierapolis. After the death of the apostle Philip, Bartholomew traveled as far as Armenia and India to preach the Christian faith, getting into various conflicts for his faith. It is said that when he was in Armenia, the acceptance of the people was immense, and that many sought him out because they wished to be converted to the Christian faith by Bartholomew, and that even the brother of the king was converted. Astyages, who was king of Armenia at that time, did not present to be a threat until that time. However, in time many priests of other religions came to his palace to complain to him, as they said that their temples were becoming empty because of the gospel of Bartholomew. The revolts and complaints of the priests were too many, so Astyages was forced to take a strong decision against the Christian apostle. Astyages had sent for Bartholomew of his own free will for a meeting. The confident apostle went safely to the king's palace, where Astyages and the other priests were waiting for him. Astyages told Bartholomew to stop preaching, and for his sake to convert and believe in their gods. However, Bartholomew, very offended, flatly refused to participate in that dishonor to his master. The other priests saw that Bartholomew would not give in, so they demanded the king the death of the apostle. So Astyages ordered his imprisonment to kill him days later for his religion. It is said that Bartholomew was cruelly beheaded alive with sharp blades, and then beheaded in public at the request of King Astyages. Thomas. When Jesus rose from the dead, he invited Thomas to put his finger in the marks left by the nails on his hands and side. Thomas marveled at what he had seen, and transformed all his doubts into faith, for he was a rather pessimistic man, and only claimed to believe in what he saw with his own eyes. After this fact, the apostle said that Jesus was his Lord and his God, committing himself to take the gospel to more people. He traveled to several places with his faith until he arrived in India, where it is believed he spent his last days. It is said that while he was in India, he participated in the construction of a palace for the king, and that he never abandoned his intense faith, because he always went to preach on the top of a mountain, today known as the Mountain of St. Thomas. Thomas, as every day, had gone out to pray to his Lord on top of the mountain, bowing in front of a stone on which he would have carved a cross, and was brutally surprised by a conspirator. In that same place, his death would have been consummated, since the murderer would have pierced the body of Thomas with a sharp spear while he was praying to his Lord with his back turned. Matthew. Matthew was a noble tax collector, and at that time those who engaged in this trade were branded as criminals and abusive. However, Matthew was caught by the teachings of Jesus and became his disciple, leaving everything behind. It is said that he preached in Judea, and while there he would have written his gospel. Matthew was an educated man, so he became the first man to write down the teachings of Jesus in Hebrew. Later, he would have traveled to Ethiopia to continue with the gospel, where he gained great popularity with his sermons, converting a large group of Christians. The story goes that King Hitarcho had fallen passionately in love with a virgin consecrated to the Lord, his niece Iphigenia. During the evangelization that Matthew carried out in Aetolia, he was able to convert a large part of the population into Christians, including the king's niece, whom he named and recognized as a virgin. However, King Hyrtacus was madly in love with the young woman and wanted to marry her. In desperation, caused by his passionate love for Iphigenia, he offered the apostle half of his kingdom in exchange for his intercession for her. Matthew, offended, suggested he go to Mass to listen to his sermon next Sunday, and so Hyrtacus, confident in his proposal, went to listen to him, but far from helping him, Matthew in his sermon sharply rebuked the king for his intention to claim for himself a consecrated virgin. Furious, Hyrtacus left the place and ordered the capture of the apostle, sending an assassin to end the life of Matthew, who was killed immediately after finishing the Mass. There, in front of the altar, a halberd was thrust through his back, killing him in seconds. James the Younger. So called to distinguish him from James the Elder, he was the youngest son of Cleophas and Mary and brother of Judas. James the Younger is probably the least known of the other apostles. However, he never left his faith aside, as he dedicated himself to preaching in Palestine and Egypt, where he was also persecuted for his religion. It is said that Santiago was murdered by leaders who were against him because of his evangelization in Egypt. The apostle would have been cruelly crucified, and later his body would have been torn to pieces with a saw. Judas Iscariot. It is said that Judas arrived from Judah, near Jericho, as a Jew, becoming the only Jew in the group, since the other disciples were Galileans. Judas was very close to Jesus, witnessed all that he preached and the miracles he did, and also developed as the treasurer of the group and led along with his master with the gospel. It is said that Judas was a violent nationalistic Jew who followed Jesus in the hope that, through him, his dreams could be realized. Judas became Jesus' betrayer, for he betrayed Jesus in exchange for 30 pieces of silver. At that time Jesus was much persecuted and sought after, so, with the help of Judas, he was handed over to his enemies, who sent him to the cross. It is said that after the death of Jesus Christ, Judas could not bear the guilt of his betrayal, so he went to return the 30 pieces of silver that had been paid to him, and then went to the outskirts of a temple to take his own life. Judas Tadeo and Simon. Judas Thaddeus was the son of Alphaeus and Mary. He was the brother of James the Younger, was one of the apostles of whom little is known, and lived in Galilee. Tradition says that he preached in Assyria and Persia and died a martyr's death in Persia. Jude Thaddeus was interested in making Christ known to the world, not as a suffering savior, but rather as a ruling king. It is believed that Jude went to preach the gospel in Edessa near the Euphrates River, and being there, he healed several and converted many who believed in the name of the Master. Judas went from there to preach the gospel in other places, and according to an ancient tradition, Judas Thaddeus and Simon toured several territories together, inducing more people to Christianity. The two were always together everywhere to preach the word of God. Both were called by Jesus to be part of the group of his 12 apostles, so they also witnessed the miracles of Jesus in Galilee and Judea, hearing his sermons. And little by little they spread Christianity to various cities, such as Persia and Egypt. It is said that in their last days, they remained in Persia and that both had managed to convert and baptize many. However, as soon as they entered the city of Swammer, they were hostilely persecuted by 2 pagan sorcerers who threatened them with death if they did not leave Christianity aside, forcing them to worship their gods. Judas Thaddeus and Simon flatly refused to worship other gods, so after some time evangelizing, in Swammer they were sentenced to death. It is said that both were imprisoned and cruelly mistreated, and then both were brutally murdered. On the one hand, Simon was bound by a large crowd and martyred until he was split in two with a saw, while Judas Thaddeus was severely beaten on the head with the dough until he was innocent, and then beheaded with a sharp axe, thus silencing the voice of the apostles. Undoubtedly, the disciples and apostles of Jesus Christ led a life of persecution, violence, and murder due to their beliefs. However, they never abandoned their faith and continued with the legacy that their master had left them.